Today we're here on Standing on the Shoulders of the Giants with Dr. Leon Vanstone.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Indeed. I'm really happy that you're here. You have a PhD in hypersonics, which is actually the cool part of rocket science, if I'm not mistaken.
It's certainly the newer part. I mean, it's all pretty hot, honestly. Like 4,000 Fahrenheit. But yeah, no, I enjoy it very much. But that's, it's just a part of who I am. I like to, if anyone asks, I normally say I'm a rocket scientist, storyteller, idiot. And aren't we all really idiots? But yeah, no, I do know a little bit of rocket science. I founded the Texas Rocket Engineering Lab for the University of Texas. That was an absolute blast. Moved on from that. At this point, almost 2 years ago, joined a startup, helped them grow.
Yeah.
From about 10 million to 100 million. And now they pivoted. I was cool with that. I actually told them to fire me, but it didn't make sense for the investor. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But yeah, and since then, I've been idioting for a month or two. My son was just born, so that was a nice. America obviously has fantastic parental leave.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I will show you a million baby photos later. But no, and that's me in a nutshell, really. Rocket scientist, storyteller, idiot.
Indeed. How did you why? Why did you get into rocket science and hypersonics? Is there a sort of a fundamental story to that, or is it more like, I don't know, want to go to the moon and beyond?
I can't claim to have had a very good plan. So I actually went from Britain, as some of your viewers may detect an accent, but I didn't go to a very good school in Britain. This sort of American, it's called a council estate. It's sort of analogous to an American, what do you call them here? Project. That's it, right? Sort of like a project. But the school I went to was okay, but they weren't exactly setting they weren't setting the bar very high, right? So I'm like, okay, well, what do I like? And I'm like, or more specifically, if I was honest, I was like, the subjects I hate the least would be maths and science. So I was doing more of those. And when I'm about 17, some guy turns around. He's like, his name's Mr. Sizer. I don't know if I'll ever see him again, but he's like, Leon, you have to go to university. And I'm like, okay, I guess.
Good shout out, though.
Yeah, right. If you're listening, Mr. Sizer, thanks very much. And so I'm like, all right, well, which one? He's like, I don't know, figure it out. Here's a book, right? Like this giant prospectus. So then my school does have a careers evening. So I go there and I find this really bored looking old man at the back who arguably changed the entire trajectory of my life. Like, I don't know who he is. I don't know if he's alive. I wouldn't recognize him if I walked past him in the street. But I walk up to this guy and I'm like, hey, are you the engineering dude? And he's like, yeah, why? I'm like, I want to do some engineering. He's like, okay. He's like, what do you like? Right? Which was, I didn't really think of the question at the time. He said, what do you like? And I said, I like planes and I like rockets and I think cars are cool, right? And he's like, oh, you should go and do aeronautical engineering at some of these universities, right? So he suggests some, I pick one, I get in, boom, off I go. And I nearly fail the first year, right? Like it was one thing to sort of be an achieving student in a shit school. It was another thing to try and achieve at a good school, right?
When you say nearly fail.
Like nearly failed, like percentage points away from failing out of that first exam. But I turn things around. I leave at the end with a respectable grade. And I'm like, well, fuck this and fuck academia. These fucking dusty ass bastards, right? Don't do anything real. Nothing matters, right? They're just fucking around with thoughts and ideas, right? So I'm like, I'm going to go to the city and I'm going to make a bunch of fucking money. Fuck you with blackjack and hookers, right? So I leave because I'm just burnt out, honestly. And I go to work for a Big Four consultancy company. I won't say which one because who knows if they'll try to sue me. And I often say that it's the best and worst decision I ever made in my life.
Okay.
I have never been so miserable in my life. Shout out for any of you listening. You have burnout when on Sunday you dread Monday, right?
That's a thing, sort of the Sunday scaries.
Yeah, right. If you're there Sunday, fuck, I have to go to work. Dude, find another career. Ain't worth it. Any of you listening, trust me on this one, right? So, but one of the nice things about suffering is it really makes you think about what you do want. And I thought back to the last time I was actually really happy. And again, what do you like, right? And I thought, man, I really enjoyed my last year. Weirdly, it was on insect flight, which is fucking fascinating, by the way. But we won't go there. And dragonflies, man, piece of art. Anyway, and I'm like, man, I actually had fun then. And I'm like, well, fuck it, right? I guess I'll do more of that. So I applied to a few PhD programs. One of them's in hypersonics.
Right.
Now, at the time, this is 2000 and something. Oof, good question, Leo. 2010.
Is there a catalyst that you specifically wanted hypersonics over something else? Was there a catalyst for that, or?
It was the first one to take me, quite frankly.
Oh.
I can't claim to have had this master plan. And, you might call it luck or, I mean, again, the thing you have to appreciate about hypersonics is actually a big problem is America shut that shit down, right? It was expensive. They didn't want to do it. No one else was really doing it.
Sure.
And so they were and they had all this cyber warfare stuff at the time. It was a real problem. So all those programs got killed, right, in favor of other things they thought were more pressing.
Right.
I was even told by, I got advice from academics, successful academics in the field who said to me, Leon, if you want to be an academic, do not do hypersonics. There's no money in it. You'll never make a career here, right? Thank you, China. And so I did that, and that was, it was great. I had a blast to some extent. I mean, it's still a PhD, so it's often quite jading at the same time. It's a very personal journey, and it's often quite frustrating. Right. That's just the nature of those things. But I got through it. I got out, and again, still hypersonics wasn't quite. I mean, it was in the military world, but that hadn't trickled down past kind of the classified barrier, right? So I decided I didn't want to be in London. I lived in London at the time. That's where my school was. So I didn't want to be there anymore. I had lived very comfortably in London for about 8 years at that point, and so I wasn't challenged by it. So I thought, I'll go somewhere else. And I hold the controversial opinion as a European, I suppose, Brexit notwithstanding. But
I was going to say, sort of European at this point.
I still consider myself, so I'm happy. I'll go with sort of European. So I hold the controversial opinion that you can go to any coffee shop in Europe, put your fingers in your ears, right? Don't listen to people speak. Don't read the menus. I challenge you to tell me what country you're in. I mean, the whole point of the EU says most of Europe can agree on a lot of its ideals. Okay, the houses over there are square and pink and the houses over there are pointy and yellow, but... And
of course, you guys drive on the wrong side of the road, but again,
I am willing to concede that. I am all for standardization. If Americans will adopt the metric system, I will drive on the right side of the road.
I will happily trade you. But I will not trade you on Celsius, but that's a different story.
Well, you're just wrong then, aren't you? But just freedom units forever, is that what we're doing? All right, we've had that discussion. We won't get into that argument. So I do all that. So I decided, okay, I just want to get out of Europe. I want to go somewhere because, a lot of respect for many of my friends that stayed in London, but I couldn't see myself being challenged that way. And so I found myself a PhD in this hillbilly hick town called Austin, right? In Texas. And at the time, I mean, I guess it's my racism there, but I kind of assumed Texans would all be these like cowboy, gun-toting, homophobe, racist, like horse riding, whatever, right?
There's definitely some stereotypes to a number of different states. Texas is definitively one of them. I would argue that Florida and for that matter, California are also of that stereotype. New York, there's more than a few.
No, I mean there are, and I'd never heard of Austin, to be very honest. I thought Houston was the capital.
Sure.
In Europe, the big city's always the capital, right? So I assumed it was Houston.
I think there are some Texans who think that Houston is also the capital, but
I think there are some Texans that think they are the capital. Anyway, so I thought, well, I'll go. I'll just go, Leon. And if you hate it, you can always leave. You can always just say, sorry, I quit. I'm out. So I show up and it's amazing here.
Yeah, I love Austin.
I love it. I mean, it's not without its problems. Don't get me wrong. London either, but it's just lovely. This is a perfect, really, really nice city. I think perfect for me. So I start working here and I start doing more work. And then, of course, hypersonics becomes a bigger thing. We start doing more scramjet work, which is where a lot of my scramjet inlet unstart was where a lot of some of my work was, at least.
Scramjet?
Yeah, you're familiar with a ramjet engine?
Not as familiar as I should be.
So you ever all right, so you have like a propeller.
Right.
Right, that's your first engine. And you have that on a World War II plane, right? It's a propeller engine. And then you say, oh, it turns out if I build something called a turbojet, right, it's basically a standard fighter jet, right? That's a better engine. So
Sure.
it's a turbojet engine. And then you say, well, what if I want to go even faster than that? Right? The propeller only get you so fast.
Mhm.
And then you say, well, I can do better with a turbojet. But then the problem you have with a turbojet is at some point you're flying so fast that the sheer force of ramming air into you does all your compression work for you. And it really messes with your compressor stage.
That's fair.
So now you're like, if I just have basically an air funnel, an air scoop,
Right.
and I slam into it fast enough, it will compress the air for me on it, with my own forward momentum. Just like if you stick your hand out of the car, you ever did that as a kid? You can fly your hand.
Right.
Right? The forward momentum of the car is doing the work for you to compress the air against your hand and keep it to balance the weight of your own arm out, right?
And that's where we get scramjets.
Well, so that's a ramjet.
That's a ramjet.
And which is, engineers are obviously very complicated people. So they named it a ramjet engine because it's a jet engine that you ram air into.
There we go.
Very complicated, I know. Hopefully no one got confused with that nomenclature. But so that's all well and good. You do have this problem, though, with a ramjet engine is if you fly fast enough, at some point the everything gets hotter. Like when you're flying that fast, compressing, just like, if you've ever blown up a football with a pump, right? Sometimes you notice the bit that goes in is hot. Compressing air makes it hot. When you're going really fast, you're compressing the crap out of that air, right? In fact, it'll get so hot that you might see several thousand Fahrenheit inside the engine, just in the air, right? The air just gets that hot from the compression. So you have this problem. If my fuel burns at, say, 1800 Fahrenheit and my air's at 2000 Fahrenheit, I am cooling my air down by burning fuel in it, which is the opposite of the way that an engine works.
Right.
And just as you can have a terminal velocity where you can fall faster and faster and faster until at some point you stop accelerating, you can also have essentially a terminal temperature, right? Which is where as you compress and compress and compress the air more, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, that it approaches the combustion temperature of your fuel.
Right.
Once that happens, you can't put energy in, right? If something's at the combustion temperature of your fuel, you can't add energy into the flow anymore. That's the whole point in burning stuff.
Exactly.
It puts heat in. If you're at the temperature it burns at, you can't add heat, right? And so the ramjet engine, I mean, there are a bunch of other problems with having a really hot core flow, but the ramjet
I didn't want to
engine,
take you too far off course, though, because I wanted to make sure that we were sort of finishing up. You were working on these scramjets, which I guess is just an upgraded version of the ramjet.
Yeah, it is. We can come back to that. But yeah, so
Okay.
I was doing some scramjet stuff. That was all fun and games. And then weirdly enough, it's sort of, I mean, again, just by pure opportunity, someone shows up and says, hey, UT, would you like, if I gave you $1 million, would you build a rocket lab? And the point in the rocket lab is less so about necessarily the scientific development of rocketry.
Right.
And it's more about the sort of systems engineering and learning. It is an experiential learning piece. So how do you train people to build rockets, right? The lab was called the Texas Rocket Engineering Lab, or TREL, as I would often call it.
Mm-hmm.
The point in TREL, I would often say this. TREL is not an organization that made rockets. TREL is an organization that made people that made rockets. Right?
Okay.
I would have been perfectly happy in that organization if every single rocket would have blown up on the stand. But if employers around the entire United States would say TREL students are the very best people we can hire. Right? If it was you hire everyone that's TREL and then you hire anyone else, but we had never successfully flown a vehicle, that would be 100% success. It would be nice to fly a vehicle, but the point of the organization was to train people to build rockets, right? Because there's a whole industry out there that really needs these people. And for the longest time, many of us as academics were forbidden from teaching this, just as hypersonics was kind of a topic you couldn't teach unless you wanted to have a lengthy conversation with the State Department. And pro tip, you don't want to have a lengthy conversation with the State Department.
I believe that. So effectively, bordering on the edge of sort of national security and classified, or at least partially classified technologies.
Yeah, it was what's now called QE, which is controlled and classified information. So it's not that the data it's not that any of it was classified, but it was controlled. So
sort of like for most of us, I would probably relate this to something like,
it's like HIPAA.
You're right, something like HIPAA. But even beyond that, I would say it's sort of like nuclear engineering. They're not going to just train anybody to become a nuclear engineer type of deal.
that kind of thing. You don't want to train people how to build. I mean, you don't want to train people how to build, nuclear reactors any more so than you want to train them how to build flying rockets, right? Because a student attempt at launching a rocket to the edge of space is easily a surface-to-air missile, right?
Right. Whereas a nuclear reactor could easily become effectively a nuclear weapon.
Or, well, more a dirty bomb would be the bigger problem.
Right.
But anyway, so that was all fun and games. Had a great time doing that for about 2 years. And it really gave me a flavor. That piece really gave me a flavor for what it was to operate. I made the second worst and best decision of my life, which was I set that lab up not to my personal career benefit. And like, if you're an academic in the US, the very honest answer is you have 5 years to get tenure. You have one chance to get tenure. If they say no, go fuck yourself.
Got it. That's how it works in the US.
Right. And not every country's like that. And, if you're here, at some level working in those universities, you can always go to the university sort of one level below you.
Right.
And say, hey, I didn't make tenure here, but will you take me? But, that answer is sometimes yes. But at the end of the day, you get one chance. And if you're betting your career on this one moment, you want to do everything to maximize your chances, right?
Of course, absolutely.
I, on the other hand, wasn't particularly concerned with tenure at the time. I mean, obviously still not, but so I built the thing to the benefit of the students, right? I built a lab that I thought the students would want to be in, that would help them flourish, that wouldn't necessarily move my career forward, but was the point in the lab was to make people that knew how to build rockets, not to make people who knew how to move my career forward.
Right, not to make the best rockets, but to make the people who make the best rockets.
Worse than that. Making the best rockets would have been the middling one.
Okay.
I could have set Trell up to make me the best academic, and I could have everyone working towards that.
Right.
And that's what most university labs are doing, quite cynically, you might say, right? Then I could have built a lab that's just supposed to do the thing it's supposed to do. And then I tried to build a lab that was supposed to build people that knew how to build rockets. At the point in the lab, everyone in it needed to understand this was about building people. It wasn't about making rockets.
Right.
And so out of that, came a lot of learnings for myself, and the lab did really well. Just in just 2 years, humbly, I might say, it became one of the crowning jewels of the engineering department at UT. Still going really strong. Shout out to Sandy Barker, who I handed the reins over. She's done a great job since then. I can't fault her at all. And then I was like, look, this sandbox clearly isn't for me, and I moved on to other things. Then I sort of started dabbling in the startup world, which is probably horrendously terrible for my career. But again, I mean, do what you like, right? And not...
As someone who's been in startups for almost 25 years, I can say that it's probably a good idea. I think everybody should at least get one stint.
If you're in a startup for 25 years, can you really call it a startup?
Well, I said I've been dabbling in them for 25 years. A few of them are pretty big at this point. But speaking of careers and sort of moving things forward and rockets and whatnot, I think you know what my next question is. In 2008, a seminal movie came out that I was dying to see and still love to this very day. And it's called Ironman. And you know where this question is going, since I'm asking it to a hypersonics and rocket scientist, which is, where's my fucking Iron Man suit?
I'm just going to say, they clearly tell you in the movie that it's a molybdendium alloy. So really it should be molybdendium, man. I'm just saying that. It should be molybdendium, man.
I hear you, but at the same time, what would it take for me to get my Iron Man suit? I understand there's multiple problems. We don't have the fictional arc reactor power source, and
there's actually all right. So yes, there's lots of problems. There's the power source, as you said. There's the servo actuators. There's a whole bunch of things. There's actually one thing I hadn't even thought about. So they tried this. They did actually launch a couple of Iron Man projects.
We had jetpacks in the 30s or whatever, right? I mean, or something of this nature.
Well, you've got them now. You got the Gravity, I think it is, right? With the little. Hilariously for me, I think they're based off of the model RC plane little pretend jet engines that they built. They're basically nerds, quote unquote.
Right.
Built. It's funny how technology just comes out of idiots playing. Same with the rockets, where it's just a bunch of nerds playing with tubes, but.
True.
The Model RC plane people built little microjet engines, and then someone realized you could get a lot of thrust out of them, strapped 8 of them together, and that's the gravity guy riding around on a jetpack, right? Which has become a whole thing. But no, so the problem you have fundamentally with the Ironman proposal is that they realized quite early on, why do I want a human involved in this? If I have the technology to wrap a robot around a human,
right?
Why don't I just build because I don't have the robots.
Right.
So let's just build a robot, remotely operated, autonomous, whatever it is, right? Just build the robot, because that's actually a lot easier than trying to wrap an actuated skeleton. Because that means that if that robot has you in it, that means that robot already carries somewhere around 200 pounds, right?
Right.
So if I take you out of it, I now have a 200-pound carrying capacity robot. And so they actually started some Ironman things. They ended up canceling them after about a couple of years because they realized that it would be probably made more sense just to make the robots.
I mean, it makes more sense, but it's definitely less fun.
Yeah, I mean, it is less fun, and that does make me a little sad.
But basically, we're talking about, I mean, what we're effectively talking about is why even do this when we basically got drone operators who can operate these things hundreds of miles away.
Yeah, I mean, so you'll always, I mean, so you would have a need from a spec ops, right? Your kind of surgical strike, and warfare is becoming more surgical, certainly, right? You would then want a human operator because you're in an austere environment, right? So you might not have comms to back to the base or to remote in or whatever it is, right?
Right.
So you'd want a human, or you might want them to be covert so that you don't want them broadcasting, right? So you'd have a human wrapped in a robot and they're running around doing some crazy ass shit, right?
Right.
And that's well and good, but the bulk of your military, 90%, 99% of your force projection is just pure threat of death, right? And that's your army. But it's just a bunch of people with a bunch of guns. If you come here, they're all going to shoot at you. You're going to be fucked. Doesn't matter how skillful you are. We're going to shoot the shit out of you, right?
So we come back to your original thing, which is why not remove the human from the equation?
Take the human out, build the robot first, and then you can remotely operate them, maybe locally by or whatever else. It's actually really interesting to think about how you would run joint human robot. The classic one, okay, here's an example. We already have an example of a robot and a human interfacing perfectly well.
Okay.
It's the self-serve checkout, right? You have 20 checkouts. You have one person that goes around and fixes them when they break. Yeah, no one wants to admit it, but it is. It's the self-serve checkout. That is a drone with a human blended together, right?
I think that's effectively true.
The human does the good things. The human, so it does all the edge cases and the exceptions. And you can always be gathering the data and improving the AIs, right? So you can have larger and larger groups. And it would be the same thing with robotics, right? You might have say a team of 6 or 5 or whatever you decide is the best number. One of them is run by a human. They take the lead. The rest of the robots basically support them. So they fire at whatever the human fires at, or they might do threat detection or whatever else. And then if the one being piloted by a human gets destroyed, you simply transfer them. They're remoted in, right? They're not in the suit. They're remote. You route them to the one next to them. They take over that and they all reform, right? And you just keep going like that. And so what I find very interesting, some of them are called cobots. It's like, how do you work humans and robots together to leverage the strengths of humans and to leverage the strengths of robots? Because we are very prone as a species to always examining ourselves through the lens of our own technology, right?
For better or worse.
Right. I mean, and it's not a bad way to do it. For the longest time, people thought the human brain was like a computer. A human brain is not like a computer. It's not a serial device. It doesn't work that way. If it did, arithmetic would be much easier for most people, right?
Sure.
And before that, if you look back, at one point we were all very concerned about our humors, right? So humans discovered hydrology, right, which is basically water. And suddenly we all believed that our well-being was about 7 fundamental humors or whatever it was, right? And the levels relative to each other. Because we were fascinated with that. Like we've always seen ourselves through the lens of our technology. Computers were no different there. And so humans aren't aren't robots. We are very... Have you heard... Okay, it's a bit of a digression, so do cut me off if it isn't great, but have you heard of freestyle chess?
Yes. Actually, there's multiple different versions. I think Fisher invented one called Chess 960 or something. I don't know. I'd have to look it up, but yeah, there's a lot of different variants.
So if you put a human against a robot, right, an AI, at this, we've got a good enough technology now, the robot always wins. And the reason for that is a robot never makes a bad move on the next move. That's a tactical decision. The robot always makes a more perfect next move. The thing that robots are really, or AIs are really bad at, though, is long-term strategic thinking.
Right.
And so in freestyle chess is, there are two teams. Each team is made up of a blend of humans and AIs. And apparently the winning combination is 3 humans, 3 AIs. So you have the 3 AIs that are you constantly feeding them information about what the board looks like and what people are doing and what you're thinking about your next moves, and they're telling you different stuff. You have 2 people managing that, and you have 1 person making decisions as to strategy. Like, hey, I want to move these pieces into these vague areas because I think something's going to come out of it.
And it turns out that combination can actually beat AI on its own.
Right. Beat any combination. It will be all AI teams and all human teams, right? And that blend, like a human robot blend is always better than a purely AI team, or if you can blend the best of both, you lose nothing, right? You cover the weaknesses of AI and robotics is they aren't good strategic thinkers. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's really interesting about the way that you blend those technologies together. Anyway, I don't want to derail the conversation too much. I have many hobbies, but don't tell the State Department. So yeah, it's just something that's really interesting about the Ironman suit. And I mean, as you were alluding to, right, there are a number of other technological problems. Power is one of them. And power limits a lot of things right now, looking for better batteries for drones. Where are my flying cars, Jetsons? I was promised a future, right?
I mean, absolutely true. But speaking of power, this definitely brings us into what I'm pretty excited about in this conversation, which is the Alcubierre warp drive. So I'd love to get sort of an overview of like what's the theory behind this? Do we need exotic matter to actually create this? Well, to power this thing or whatever. And then beyond that, as we've sort of discussed a little bit offline, I'd love to talk about basically the warp drive with fusion, because there seems to be some really amazing stuff happening.
Yeah, this is a fun one.
Sort of high to low. And for those listening, basically, warp drive is what it sounds. It's faster than light travel, but theoretically without actually breaking the general and special relativity laws. But can you sort of dive into like that again from the high level, and then I'd love to go into the exotic stuff.
Yeah, I'd be happy to chat about that. And a special caveat here. To any physicists, listen, I'm obviously not classically trained as a physicist.
That's propulsion.
I'm not even modernly trained as a physicist. So somewhere, there are many physicists spinning in their graves as an alternative source of power. Perhaps we could rig them up to something, and generate some power that way. But, but no. So certainly take this in the spirit it's intended more so than exactly. But so Alcubierre, as I understand it, was a Mexican physicist, and he gets a bit bored in 1994 and decides to sit down and mathematically prove that a warp drive is possible, which is a very interesting thing because it's amazing what happens when you can tell children they do things. There's a reason that most of those Star Trek technologies came true. It wasn't that Gene Roddenberry was a great futurist. No offense to the man. In my humble opinion, if you tell children they can do something, when they become adults, they don't forget that, right? Hey, I can have a flip open transmitter device that will work over thousands of miles. Some kids I will fucking make this.
Honestly, that's one of the things about, again, from my childhood, growing up to literally watching, sneakers and even before that, war games, et cetera. I mean, those were definitely pretty fundamental things from my childhood as well. So I agree with you completely.
No, and I mean, as a slight tangent, it's amazing how many technologies from the Star Trek universe came true. And I think it really is because you inspired someone they could do it, and then they were like, fuck you, physics, I'm doing it anyway, right? And they found a way. So Mr. Alcubierre, an editable moment, Mr. Alcubierre, or Doctor, sorry, actually, Jesus, Dr. Alcubierre, Mexican scientist. He sits down, gets bored one day in 1994, and he decides to prove that you can have a warp drive. And the Futurama said this best, where you can't go faster than the speed of light, but you can move the entire universe around you faster than the speed of light. And if that confuses you, good, because it fucking should. That's how you know you're not a physicist. But the long and short of it is, the way to think of the speed of light, it's like a speed limit. It's the fastest we think you can transmit information through the universe, which is a
sort
really...
of the C in E equals MC squared.
Right, that's the C in E equals. It's a 3 times 10 to the 8, off the top of my head, more or less, in a vacuum, right, would be the speed of light. And the way to think of it is, imagine I have a sheet. Imagine we're holding a bed sheet tight between us, right? That parachute game that kids love to play.
Yeah.
If I ripple the sheet, a ripple moves through it, right? And if I ripple the sheet harder, a ripple moves quicker, right? What we seem to observe in the universe is there is a fundamental limit to the speed that ripple will move. You cannot move quicker than that, and that is the speed of light. The speed of light moves the fastest anything can move because it has no mass. So it is the least impeded in moving through that system. But there is, for whatever reason, a speed limit. We don't know why. And so that's a problem if you want to try and move through everything quicker, right? But that doesn't mean I can't take 2 ends of the sheet, fold them over on themselves, and then wiggle them next to each other, which is to some extent what the warp drive says. It says, or in fact, what the warp drive says is, can I bunch the sheet up in front of me and then wiggle through it with everything bunched up to transmit really quickly? I haven't technically moved the wave through the sheet any quicker. What I've done is bunch it all together to wiggle it at once.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the concept of this. So
such that you can effectively move the distance that it would be in the time that would be faster than the speed of light, but you actually haven't used propulsion in that mechanism. You basically just folded space-time.
Yeah, and the act of folding space-time in much in the same way that the planet distorts space-time all the time, right? With the planet distorts space-time that sits us in a gravity well, things fall into it.
Right.
And that's often visualized like, imagine a big rubber sheet and you put a bowling ball in it, right?
And so if we're doing this just for a practical example, I think the closest star is Proxima Centauri, something like that. And it's roughly 4 light years away. And effectively it's 4 light years, meaning 4 years at the speed of light. If we had an Alcubierre drive, we could effectively get there in, let's say, 1 year, which would be basically like 4.
You can get
roughly
there
4x faster.
Yes, but the problem with Mr. Alcubierre, and this is physicists for you versus engineers, right? Mr. Alcubierre needed 1 solar mass. So I would have to take the mass of E equals mc squared. Tells me how much energy is given for a certain amount of mass. If I took the entire mass of a sun, which has more zeros than I care to honestly think about on the end of it.
Yeah.
Like you're talking about trillions upon trillions of tons of sun, right? And I turned all of it spontaneously into energy, which a sun does slowly. Our sun turns turns a fraction of its mass into energy over the course of about 13 billion years. That's about right, off the top of my head. And even so, most of the mass of if I turned all of it into energy at once, right, just utter staggering amount of energy that would release, I would need that much energy to run his Alcubierre drive, right? And what's more, I would need something called exotic matter. Exotic matter is a physicist way of saying unobtainium.
Right.
It is a substance that, while not illegal by the rules of physics, has never been seen, never even really been theorized to exist. Like not even in a particle accelerator does this shit show up, right? We've never seen this, never had evidence of it actually existing, but the rules of physics say maybe it's there somewhere, right?
That it could theoretically
theoretically exist, right? Which is like, I don't know.
Dilithium crystals in Star Trek, effectively.
So, I mean, yeah, it's again, it's unobtainium, it's a McGubbins, right? But the math was solid, and that was interesting. I mean, I'm not
Sure.
trying to knock his work. He did good work, but just it wasn't very practical. Well, what's very relevant is a bunch of people turned around. COVID was a hell of a time for all of us, and a bunch of physicists were apparently very bored and possibly unhappy in their marriages. So anyway, they threw themselves into their work, and what some of them worked out was, and I won't bore you with the math, but they worked out it might be possible to do some of this with, quote unquote normal stuff. Still some pretty crazy things in terms of what you're trying to do, but materials we've seen, properties we somewhat understand, right? And so they found a way at very small scales, quantum scales, microscopic scales, that you could use this thing to distort space-time. And that was
at a quantum level.
Yeah, very tiny, right? Because the bigger the space-time because the Alcubierre guy, for fun, what he did was he did his math that showed it was theoretically possible, and then he applied it to a ship, a conceptual ship about the size of the USS Enterprise. He called his paper the warp drive, right? But if you back out from that and say, okay, well, it's doable, but what I need to do is I want to do it in a really small scale, suddenly your energy requirements drop incredibly, right? And if you make some other tweaks, again, you can get some gains. And essentially, it turns out you can distort space-time, probably. This is all still theoretical. No one's proved it. But you can do it with real materials that actually exist that humans can make and an amount of power that is within reach. Like, I mean, you're maybe still building yourself a power plant to sit next to your research facility.
Sure.
Or your own substation, right?
Probably
to pull off the national grid, but it's doable. It's a reasonable amount of energy. And then you can have tiny quantum or microscopic distortions of space-time. And okay, that all sounds well and good. And a friend of mine, actually, he runs the Zero Carbon Institute, the ZCI Institute. Right. Looking for pre-seed. If any of your, anyone's willing to invest, I'm happy to connect you. You can come find me on LinkedIn. But he had this fucking brilliant idea that no one really thought about, right? Which is, if you want to do fusion, your problem is that you need to stick two atoms on top of each other. And atoms, much like the north poles of a magnet, don't want to be next to each other. And in fact, the closer you get them, the more you have to push. And you can imagine fusion. Imagine you had two Play-Doh atoms, right?
Sure.
And they're magnetic. And so the more you push them together, the more they fight you. But if you can get them to touch, suddenly, nyom, they turn into one big glob of Play-Doh, right? They fuse. Now, the process of doing that spits out a buttload of energy.
Hence why we use fusion bombs instead of fission bombs,
right? Or
just
and that's why cold fusion has been this, glorious promise, right? This golden bullet, right? Free, cold unlimited energy.
Can you go dive into that for just a half second? Cold fusion, basically fusion at room temperature or thereabouts.
Yeah. So fusion happens in the sun all the time.
Right.
The sun is an incomparably large explosion, right? So the sun is an explosion so large that the only thing that stops it from eradicating the entire solar system is the sheer gravity, the mass of its own explosion, right? So all this crushing mass is crushing everything down. It's always trying to explode out. Its gravity is always pulling it in, and it sits there at equilibrium, right? It's super hot. It's super angry. It probably hates you. Who really knows? But and that's hot fusion, right? That's just, hey, I have the entire mass of a sun to crush a bunch of shit, and you're going to have a bad day. Cold fusion is, well, I'd like to be on planet Earth, and I don't want to eradicate everything in a 400-kilometer circle, right? So I need to do this less extremely. And there's a few brute force approaches you can take to achieving that. Because at the end of the day, all you need to do is push two atoms on top of each other, or two nuclei even, right? Mm-hmm. And you can do that with sheer oppressive, crushing pressure and enormous, ridiculous temperatures that might overcome those forces, which is what a sun does. Or you can try and achieve it another way. So Some fusion reactors use magnetic confinement, and some of them use photons.
And so your friend is doing this in a relatively unique way, which I'm guessing has to do with the warp drive.
Yeah, so those are very brute force approaches, right? Which is, yes, I know they will fight me, and I will just have to find a way to push harder.
Right.
And that's what makes it so tough. And I mean, recently there was an announcement, of course, they came out with, not to make your show too dated, but they came out with a recent announcement that they've got more energy out of a fusion reaction they put in, which is an absolute milestone, right?
Technically, a match does that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, they are a long way from generating a power plant that could run with a cold fusion source, because as you correctly said, a match generates more energy than you put in it. But I'm not going to be powering cities with it. But still, it was a landmark. But it's this promise for, at this point, I think 60 years.
Yeah.
And now they finally got more energy out than they put in, and now it's okay, physically possible, and that's an engineering problem, right?
Right.
Good luck to those engineers. But this guy's got this third approach, which I just thought was brilliant, right? And it goes like this. I have two particles. I want them to be on top of each other. It's hard to physically push them together in real space. But I can distort space-time. And when I distort space-time, interestingly, all of the forces of physics don't scale proportionally, which means I can bend them together in space-time, but still have them feel like they're far apart.
So this is sort of that incongruence between relativity and quantum theory.
Right. And basically I fold space-time on itself so that I fold the two things on top of themselves, and then I let them go nyump together. But from the perspective of, the relative perspective of each of them, they're still far apart until they're on top of each other. And then they fuse and give out a buttload of energy. So it's like a hack. It's a quantum cheat, right?
Yeah.
And so you can essentially lens space-time to form what could best be described as a quantum crucible, right? Some angry little section of space-time, and then I can pew atoms into it, and I could use anything. You know that Back to the Future piece where he's got like Mr. Fusion.
Mr. Fusion, he throws a banana in there.
You can fuse anything lighter than iron. You can fuse it. So you got some carbons, you got some night. This thing could run on air.
So why lighter?
Water.
Why lighter than iron? There's got to be there's a chemical explanation, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So this is why there's so much iron in the universe, which is, it turns out if you fuse iron together, you get less energy out than you put in. Although actually, technically, that's for a sun. You would have to actually in fairness to our listeners, we would have to rerun the math. Currently this idea is theoretical. You'd have to figure out how much energy you need to put in to lend space-time appropriately to merge things. You always get energy out, but in the furnace of a sun, you have to put a certain amount of energy in. And so that's when a lot of suns go supernova. It's when most of their core turns to iron and they start fusing iron. There's nothing to keep them expanded, and gravity crushes them down, and then they either explode or turn into a black hole.
Sure. Would there be a difference in the sort of atomic numbers of the things that we try this on? I think iron's 26, and hydrogen's 1 or something like that?
Hydrogen's 1, yeah. Good old hydrogen.
But I guess, you could effectively fold things...
water would be great.
...into themselves all the way up. Well, sure. That way you've got hydrogen and oxygen.
But yeah, you could do anything. Quite frankly, carbon's not that high. Nitrogen either. You could do air. Air would be a good start.
Okay.
But yeah, it would theoretically work on almost anything, depending on how much. I don't know where that energy cutoff, what the energy input is to fold things comes in at. But
so where is your friend's experiment at present?
So this research came out last year.
Okay.
Right, where they were like, hey, we think we can do this legit, right? Not just, hey, this is fun on a blackboard, right? This is fun in a lab now. So he's now raising money. Again, wealthy listeners. He's now doing some pre-seed. He wants to build a research consortium. He's taken a very it's like a biotech approach. Like a biotech company, right? Like,
Sure.
okay, hey, we think this is the answer. We're going to work on it for 10 years and then sell it to some big pharma group for whatever, right? He wants to do a similar thing, build basically a research consortium, research the whole thing, prove that it works. So he's trying to basically build the first round of that, whereas about 5 years from now, you could probably have a lab experiment that confirms you bend space-time.
Yep.
Which is super interesting for two reasons. If it works, it also means a warp drive would be possible. And two, it also leads, because you can warp space-time, it also begs questions as to things like anti-gravity drives, right?
That's interesting.
If you can bend space-time, you move, if you can set it up almost like a surfer riding a wave. It's hard to explain because we live in 4D space, right? 3 dimensions in time. It's sort of a higher order projection of that, but essentially the warp drive works. It doesn't require traditional propulsion. You just, no more so than if you lifted me above the floor and dropped me, I don't need a thruster to slap me into the ground and break my legs, right?
Sure.
In the same way, it bends space-time and you fall into the gap you create in front of you, right? So you could sit on Earth, turn this machine on and go, whoop, if you could do it at scale. And so that's some of the really interesting, he's focused on the power piece, but those are some really if you can do that, theoretically, you can start to move on to some really interesting pieces about where do we go as a species? What does that mean for us? What do we want to do? Do we want to go to other stars? Are these things even possible?
Well, I definitely want to get into that at some point. But before we do that, let's come back down to Earth for a second.
Rubbish.
I know. We're definitely going to go back to outer space. But before we do that, there's been some interesting developments, at least somewhat recently, in thrust vectoring, like dogfighting and various things. If you've sort of seen the new Top Gun movie, there were some pretty amazing maneuvers in there that were basically impossible. And the answer to a lot of those that look like how the hell did it do that is effectively thrust vectoring. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it starts obviously with the recognition that you can ride my tail anytime, but yeah, okay, so thrust vectoring then, basically if you have an engine that pushes a bunch of air out the back of it, and that's thrust, right? Be it a rocket engine or plane engine, whatever it does. You have a choice of either moving the engine, so that's what most rockets do, right? They are constantly rejigging where the engine is pointed, and that's quite mechanically challenging, especially for an aeroplane, which tend to be a little less brute force than a rocket. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
So what they do on the airplanes is they try to tilt the outside of the engine. So you see some of this sometimes with you see it with the adaptable outlet on like afterburnered engines where they'll like open the outlet out a bit to give you better performance. Yeah. And you have to recognize, right? It's just like a car, right? The engine is designed for a certain RPM. Right. Most cars are designed to be optimally efficient somewhere between 50 and 60 miles an hour, right? A plane engine is, most planes have an optimal cruise speed. That's where their configuration is designed to live, the engine, the whole vehicle. And so if you like an afterburner, if you just throw a whole bunch of fuel into the hot exhaust that will burn and put more energy in, it's not efficient, but that's not the point, right? You're running from a missile at this point. Efficiency is not, it's like humans do well jogging, right? But man, a bear runs much faster than I jog. Sometimes the sprint is worth it, right? And my legs might go to hell and, you'll end up, with all the what's the acid called? Anyway,
lactic acid,
right? That just messes your legs up. But sometimes sprinting is really evolutionary worthy, right?
Sure.
Same is true with some of these engine configurations. So thrust vectoring says, okay, I kind of have the technology to adjust my nozzle outlet then to make me more efficient when I am doing these really stupid off-design things.
Bigger versus smaller.
Yeah, you can make the hole bigger, make the hole smaller. There's a joke there, I'm sure. But and so then they said, well, okay, what if we steer it, right? What if the plane is flying forward, but I'm blowing the air not in the same line as the plane off to the edge, right? I can get it to do weird loop-de-loops. And there's some crazy stuff you can see online. All of that is mechanical, though. So what you do is you have a duct that comes out the back of the engine, and you are pointing the duct in some direction.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that real breakthrough in, especially from the point of view of Top Gun, which is high, very high speed vehicles, is called fluidic thrust vectoring. And what happens here is you distort the flow. So what you do is you might have along one edge of your engine, right? Let's say the bottom edge. So you have a rectangular engine, right? And it's longer than it is tall. So along the edge, you might have a series of jets that you can turn on.
Sure.
And when you turn them on, they bleed a bunch of air in. Not very much, but some. And what that will do is it will generate a giant shock, because all this air comes in, and that's going to make a shock wave. I won't try and explain better than that to your viewers why, but just trust me that it will. That shock generates a massive pressure amplification.
Right.
So all the fluid that goes through it is now much higher pressure than the opposing wall where you've done nothing. And if you have surface there, it will, one, apply a lot of pressure to that surface because it's gone through the shock, and two, the shock itself will distort the flow. And so you can start to abuse the physics of your flow. So instead of having to have some crazy mechanical actuator, because that's the problem you have, is as you go faster and faster, your forces get enormous and your temperatures get enormous.
Right.
So sticking something into the flow that sees all that heat and that pressure is a surefire way to get it melted. That's why most things that aren't a space shuttle, which is covered in thermal tile, don't fly faster than about Mach 5. And so you're like, well, what if I could use the flow as my actuator? I don't care about the flow. It gets exhausted out the back and blows away, right? So is there something I can do there? And
so you're effectively talking about basically just, instead of one big giant sort of flame and propulsion coming out the back, sort of adjusting that in a certain way such that the flow is discombobulated, for lack of a better word, and that way you can maneuver in new and exciting ways.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you understand the physics of the flow quite well, you can, okay, here's a good example. You know how the butterfly flaps its wings and there's a hurricane?
Yep.
Right? If you understand that you have a chaotic system, or if you can design it to be chaotic.
And this is from the chaos theory. A butterfly flaps its wings in Hong Kong, and suddenly there's there's
a tornado, right?
Months later, there's a tornado somewhere else.
Tiny changes somewhere can produce enormous changes somewhere else, right?
Correct.
So if you understand the physics well enough, you can design specifically for those systems. So you can say, I want the outlet of my engine to be chaotic. And that is to say, all the way up near the front of my outlet, right? The exit of the very beginning of my exhaust.
Yes.
I know I'm really unstable. I design it to just be stable, and then I poke at it intentionally to piss it off. But downstream of that, before I've left my exhaust, before I've left the actual plane, now the flow is doing something completely different.
Okay.
And by doing so, without actually changing the physical geometry of my outlet, but by poking at it to piss it off, I've completely changed the way the flow's coming out of that hole. Which, again, I'm sure there's a joke there somewhere.
Definite joke in there.
That's what she said. Anyway, maybe that's an editable moment. Maybe it's not. We'll never know. So the point being,
we'll just say that's what he and they said.
That's what
there
they
you
said.
Go. We covered all the bases at that point.
I've definitely had someone say that to me. Such is life. It's a hard life being a nerd.
I find it incredibly enjoyable.
That's what he said. Anyway, all right. So, well, in the effort to not get you cancelled on your first podcast, but yeah, so you can basically abuse the flow, and that is likely on these high speed Top Gun-esque vehicles.
Yeah,
that's how you do thrust vectoring. You intentionally design your system to be chaotic. You poke at it in the place you know it's susceptible. It's kind of like making the flow ticklish.
There you go.
And you know a tiny input will give you a massive output.
Well, that's interesting. I definitely, I mean, for me, Top Gun was a pretty seminal movie in the 80s. And then, of course,
I heard also it was pretty seminal.
The new ones was pretty amazing as well. Yeah, it definitely was super seminal.
It's all that. It's all that. It's all that. Like it's all the bit I really love is there's an interview supposedly with Tom Cruise. They're like, did you not think it was weird they were putting all that suntan oil on you?
You know, what can you do? You got to appeal to everybody.
Yeah, hey, I'm all for equal opportunities. Do what you want, but I'm just like, damn, that was a brave movie for the 80s.
So the question becomes, going back to outer space, if Elon came up to you and said, Doc, Leon,
Doc Vanstone.
I've
got gray hair. I'm putting things into my Mr. Fusion blender.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
But if he came up to you and said, help me go to Mars, let's do this. Would that be an interesting opportunity for you, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, if someone showed up and said to me, you can get on this rocket, it's a 50% chance it blows up on the launch pad, or there's a 50% chance you get there, right? Do you want to go there? And the answer is yes. I
mean, if the question is literally, if Elon actually came up to you and said, let's do this.
Oh yeah, let's fucking go. As long as I get to go on it, I better be on it.
So you'd want to both design it and go on it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one, I think if you are going to build a risk of death into a machine, you need to be one of the first ones on it. And I actually quite respected Jeff Bezos for that one.
Totally fair.
Being the first guy to get on and put his brother on it, right? Although I will say, credit to them, if you have an experimental vehicle, what is the best way to demonstrate to the general public that you think it's safe?
Clearly, you should fly on it.
You should get on it with your family members. That's a great way to be like, oh no, this isn't.
Yeah, we're all set.
We're all set.
Well, first of all, how would we get there? Like, again, how does this work? How would we get there? Why haven't we done this? Are the Van Allen radiation belts a problem? Is the funding a problem? Are there big giant asteroids in the way? Like, what's the issue?
No, here? It's all just funding. I mean, the technology's been there for a very long time. Frankly, the issue is political at this point, right? So,
it's expensive.
I mean, it is expensive. I mean, although at this point, the cumulative budget for the ISS is about 100 billion, and I think there was a white paper in 2008, off the top of my head. Don't quote me on that, readers, but around that time where NASA looked at a Mars mission, which, I mean, quoted a similar price, about 100 billion.
Right.
But it's which is a tiny, I mean, honestly, in terms of like human GDP, right? In terms of all the money in the world, it's not even a lot of money. I mean, God, it's 1/7 for 1 year. You could cut 1/7 of the American military budget out.
Not going to happen, but continue.
I know it's not practically doable, but just to illustrate the point, right? And then you could go to Mars. You could send humans to Mars.
It is practically doable. We're just not going to do it.
Well, no, because the trouble is, if you take the budget out 1 year, you fire all those people. You can't just rehire them the next year, right? They've gone somewhere else. So I understand you can't just do that. I'm not advocating for that. Please, military people, don't send me angry emails. That's not what I'm trying to say. But still, just to put some context, right? It's not an enormous amount of money in the grand scheme of things. Right. You could go to Mars, and you might find something, you might not. Who really knows? Just to kind of say you did it, I think would really capture the imagination of many people, just as the moon landing did, right? Who wouldn't watch that?
I think to this day, it's the most watched television event of all time.
I mean, if it's not, it should be. And so I urge you to go out there, viewers, and watch it on YouTube. But what's stopping it? Yeah, it's budget. What stops us having a moon base? It's politics. I mean, here's a good example of something. Do you know what the maximum width of the SLS rocket is?
No.
So, if you go to a US senator and you say, you're NASA, as you know, you randomly are, you go to NASA and you say, I want to build a go fuck yourself Saturn V version 2 rocket.
Right.
And I want however many billions to do this. They will say to you, okay, I'm interested, but what does my state get out of that?
Sure.
How many jobs you bring in me, blah, 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 right? And that's why there are so many NASA centers spread around the US, right? Versus something like SpaceX, where they build them, SpaceX builds everything at the launch site. They produce it there, they build it there, they assemble it there, and they launch it there, right?
I believe a lot of that's here in Austin still to this day.
I mean, possibly, but just, they build it very locally to where they launch it,
Yeah.
right? Whereas in the US, it all gets built in all these different centers. So how do you move them? How do you move stuff around, right? The answer there is by truck. So the maximum width of an SLS rocket is that on a low clearance truck bed, it has to fit under whatever the national standard is for an overpass.
Which is probably like 14 or 15, I think.
Yeah, it's about 15 feet, right? And you can't be wider than that, right? And then you ask, why is the overpass height the width that it is, right? The overpass height is related to the width of a standard road. And do you know what drives the width of a standard road?
What's that?
If you sat two horses next to each other, that's the width of a standard US road, right? And so you're literally saying, because of all this kind of government bureaucracy, the SLS rocket is in some way tenuously linked to the size of a horse's ass.
That's interesting. It's also fair. And quite frankly, this doesn't surprise me. Infrastructure has to move from various places in the country, and there's only so many ways to do that.
Yeah, but you could build that whole rocket in one place. There's no reason you have to do another. I'm just saying, like, bureaucracy.
Yeah. By the way, I did just look it up. It looks like SpaceX is starting construction just outside of Austin.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
And then because they've got the Starship launch sites in Texas, right? So they're basically building it all in the same place, shipping it there and assembling it, right? Yep. And so that really is a big problem, right? From the point of view, we've been able to go to the moon since the 1960s, right? People say, why can't we have a moon base? You can have a moon base. You just lack the political will. What was the...
So this is not a technological issue, is what I'm hearing.
It's never been a technological issue. Okay. Well, okay. I mean, you won...
Hasn't been one in a while.
You won the space race, right? The ISS is just a bunch of spaceships that you stapled together.
Right.
Right. In the same way, you build a moon base, you could land a bunch of landers on the moon, staple them together, call it a moon base. And then, okay, you have to keep resupplying it. That's a pain in the ass, right? But it's entirely doable. The real problem is, if you go to the moon, who owns it? Right? It becomes this big political problem.
I believe we planted a flag in '69, so...
It's very Western of us to be like, we come in peace, but also we own this. Fuck you.
Well, it depends on really how you look at it, right? I mean, we carved up Antarctica in the sense that no one effectively owns any part of it.
No, and that's actually very interesting. So there isn't really space law in the sense that no one has really agreed to who owns the moon. There are a few treaties and things, although a large number of major powers haven't agreed to them. The law of space is fascinating, like LAW, not LORE. I don't have, what is it, 15 billion years worth of time. But no, the law of space is really interesting and how we're trying to figure that out. And I mean, and that is, it's a really interesting piece, right? America won the space race.
Right.
Which is a strange thing to say, I think, when the Soviets...
I mean, they had the jump on us, no question.
Yeah, I think it was first satellite?
First satellite, first person.
First man, first woman.
First woman as well, yeah. I think it was, Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin, and I can't remember her name for some reason.
No, I don't. Probably is.
All right, that's shameful, but still.
That is bad of us both. Hopefully if you're listening, viewers, comment, send us a message, tell me who that was, and I'll look it up after.
Valentina Tereshkova.
Valentina Tereshkova, right? First woman in space. Yeah. Thank you, comrade. But yeah, and I mean, shit, the first cat, the first dog, the first everything, right? I mean, all this sort of stuff. But America won the space race. Mm-hmm. And okay, history's written by the winners, so there's that going for us. But America did genuinely win the space race, right? And the reason for that is the space race was an arms race, right? It wasn't a first past the... It wasn't like a, 100-meter dash race. Because if it was, Russia would have won, right? Space race is an arms race. You win an arms race not by being the first one there, but being the last one standing, right? America went to the moon, landed on the moon, and said, we can put a fucking nuke here and fuck your shit up. From the moon, motherfucker.
I was going to say, speaking of that, if I recall correctly, there was some sort of piece of paper that passed over Eisenhower's desk where they were effectively going to nuke the moon.
I mean, you nuked almost everything else. You nuked the Seychelles or whatever it was. Project Starfish, there's a Wikipedia entry. They nuked space. There's a whole radiation band that you have to navigate now because America was like, I'm going to blow some shit up.
Yeah, I mean, there was an actual U.S. plan to blow up the moon so we could win the Cold War, which is just ridiculous. But for more information, go ahead and Google that. But yeah.
God, all right. But no, I mean, and we've had that to talk about ever since. But you have to understand, right? The space race happened. America wins. The USSR basically bankrupts itself / kind of gives up because it isn't doing too well.
Right.
Everyone turns around and looks at themselves and says, "Okay, the fourth theater. So you've got 5 theaters of war. You have land, sea, air, space, and then cyber. Right?
Sure.
So the fourth theater, or the fourth domain, of war, space, right? Basically bankrupts one of the only 2 superpowers in existence. And everyone looks around and says, yeah, that's fucking expensive. How about we don't? And everyone goes, yeah, that's a great idea.
Right.
So they take the US sort of military version of space and they form NASA from it, right? NASA becomes a transparent civilian organization. Any government anywhere in the world is welcome to come to all the facilities to have all of the data, everything you want. If you want to pay some money, you can send some astronauts, yada, yada, yada. You can inspect all the payloads. It's purely civilian. This is motherhood and apple pie in space, right?
Sure.
And I am absolutely all for the furtherment of
I love
humankind,
NASA.
right? I do too. Great bunch of people. So the problem you have, though, is though China shows up, right? Thank you, China, for jumpstarting my career. China shows up and they're like, hey, we want to put some astronauts on the space station. And NASA's like, well, your astronauts are all military. We did the thinly veiled thing of taking military guys into a civilian org, but that's materially important, apparently. Right? China says, no, fuck you.
They're all going to be military.
They're all going to be military. Everything's going to be military. I'm not sharing anything with you, right? And then NASA says, well, then you can't come play. So China says, well, fuck you then. I'm going to build my own space station with blackjack and hookers.
It's a hell of a space station.
It's hard to argue, right? So China starts launching rockets because everyone starts launching because, whatever, China. And a bunch of them crash. But pretty soon they're not crashing. Then they put a space station up. Everyone laughs. That'll never work, right? You don't have the launch consistency. First one did crash. Second one, though, no one's laughing anymore. Right? So then they're up there, second space station. Okay, it's going pretty well. Not perfect, but still, they're doing it. And they're doing it like, I don't know what they're researching on that space station, but it ain't motherhood and apple pie. I guarantee you that's like AKs in space. I don't know, like, right? They're figuring some stuff out. And exactly the same time, more or less, that they did that, funding for the ISS falls apart, right? Because everyone's like, why am I paying billions of dollars for motherhood and apple pie when those guys get space AKs and hookers?
Right. It's a tough trade.
No, it is. I mean, it's the same thing with the nuclear anti-proliferation treaty between the US and Russia, right? When China shows up and is building all the nukes it wants because it never signed that treaty,
right.
Why would you agree to stay in that? You can't. You can't let China beat the two, both of you. So it falls apart, right? I mean, Russia was the first one to basically blink, but still.
The MAD doctrine is still, there's a reason it's called MAD. The mutually assured destruction is still MAD. It's silly, but
right, but you
understandable,
need to,
tit for tat.
Right, but you need to keep it MAD, right? It needs to be mutually assured. If you let China keep doing arms development, eventually it won't be mutually assured. They'll win. Right? And so you have this problem that you don't want China to get ahead of you, so you have to say, fuck you, I'm out, right? I mean, Russia blinked first, but I don't think America was in any way sad that they did.
Right.
America has no intention of trying to renegotiate that, right? Or if they do, not without China, because they don't want anyone beating them. The U.S. military threat is overmatch, right? Which basically means curb stomping everyone that would even vaguely try to oppose you, right? And it is quite hilarious. But so anyway, China shows up, builds its space station. That kind of worked out. Everyone isn't laughing anymore, right? And then China's like, and now we're going to the moon. right? And what happens? Almost immediately, ISS funding falls through the floor. They're talking about selling it or crashing it into the ocean.
Yep.
And immediately we're like, moon base now. And not in a way that they're like, you've seen administrations do this. And each administration in the US will cancel the last guys. You know, George W. Bush wanted to go to the moon. Barack Obama canceled it and said we were going to Mars. Trump comes in and cancels that and says, I don't even know.
Space Force is what he said.
Space Force. Space Force is an interesting one, actually, because what the Space Force was an explicit declaration that the fourth domain of war was open for business. That's what that said, right? Space Force always existed. It sat under the U.S. Air Force. It was a budgetary item in the U.S. Air Force, right? They just took it out and made its own one. And what they said was, we are here. We came to fuck. Right, that's what when they announced the Space Force, Trump was saying, we have come to fuck you in space.
Yikes.
They're like, we've got our own blackjack and hookers, motherfuckers. It's not motherhood and apple pie. It's blackjack and hookers, right? And that's what that was. And everyone laughed, and it was a little absurd. But the costumes especially are a little strange. I don't know who designed those. But, I mean, and it sounds weird to us, having never heard it. I'm sure the Air Force sounded weird to people who had never heard it, right?
Right.
But what that was declaring hunting season in space, right? This is now another war zone like anywhere else. We have no rules. We have nothing. It's going to be a shit show. So when China said we're building a moon base, what the fuck do you do when China lands on the moon with a flag? It's ours now. Or what if what if they don't even do that? What if there's just one patch of ice on the moon? Ice on the moon. Ice is super useful.
Right.
Ice is obviously water. It's food, because now you have water to grow food. It is oxygen, because you can split it with electrolysis of water using solar panels.
Yep.
And it is also rocket fuel, because once you split it with electrolysis, you can recombine it for rocket fuel, right?
Sure. You have oxygen for the atmosphere and hydrogen for your propulsion.
Right. You have everything you need, right? So if you are the one that lands on the only piece of water on the moon, frozen water, and you say, this belongs to me, what the fuck are you going to do about that? Because, man, they can really see you coming from Earth. They've got time to fire back. You know what I mean? So if they land that and they say, this is mine, you're fucked. I mean, you can obviously attack the outpost.
Sure.
But doing so likely starts, I mean, worst case, World War III.
Well, let's not do that.
I mean, I would prefer not to, but I'm just saying, like, this is the problem. This is why it was, this is why it was such a political issue.
Yeah.
Because who owns the moon? The moon is 1/3 the diameter of the Earth, right? Think of that. It's probably the largest thing. If you look up at the moon one night, it's the largest thing you'll probably ever see. You can look at the sun. Don't look at the sun. PSA. But you can through a screen or anything else, right? And sure, you'll see it. But you don't really see detail. Just a blob, right?
Yeah.
The moon is the largest thing you will ever see. It is 1/3 the diameter of the Earth. It is larger than the entire continent of the United States.
Yeah, it's enormous.
Of America, right?
And actually, if you get even an intro telescope, you can see reasonable amounts of detail.
Yeah, crazy detail, which I would encourage our listeners to do. But man, this thing's fucking huge, right? If you own the moon, in terms of land area and resources and everything else, that the moon. Here's an analogy, right? Imagine you live on the bank of a tiny river, right? And you hear about this faraway land. You have two choices. You want to go there, right? You build a rowboat that can get down your tiny river, but at some point it turns into an enormous ocean. So you have to build a rowboat that you can drag across an entire ocean. Right? That's a pain in the ass. That takes so much engineering, so much hope. Your other options are sailing to the mouth of the river, building a dry dock, and then building an ocean-worthy vehicle, and then sailing to the New World that way. Similarly, the moon represents a gateway, a dry dock to our solar system, right? It has all of the same shit on it that we have on Earth, more or less, right? It's already in orbit of the Earth. It's close enough that if something goes horrendously wrong, you can get to it. Like, this would be a great place to build to build
something.
To build something. And just as they're talking about having you go to low Earth orbit, you get picked up by a lunar tug, it takes you to the moon. On the moon, you've built the giant rocket that's going to go somewhere else, right? And then that's where you stage shit to go to Mars from. That'd be so much easier. Like, and if you own that, strategic resource, everyone else is fucked.
Makes sense.
And America is used to hand fisting people. Right? It's used to fucking people. The whole Western world is, and it wants that too. I mean, And so when China said it was going to go, they're going to go too, and they mean it. I mean, you look at what they're doing and who they're, the money they're spending, the contracts they're signing. America is absolutely going now, and I mean, it's nice. It's nice to see that. I think it's long overdue. It's obviously sad it has to happen on the backdrop of war, but that is often the cost of technological progress, right? Like,
sure. So.
Hit me.
Now we really need to talk about UFOs because you knew this was coming, right? I mean, we basically explored a number of different topics, and UFOs is clearly next. So, are they here? Have they been here?
Well, I mean, according to the U.S. government, absolutely, and there are no shortage of pilots, astronauts, ship captains that will tell you that UFOs are absolutely a thing. I mean, on the flip side, though, much like Bigfoot, literally everyone in the world has a 4K camera at this point.
Yeah.
And yet somehow sightings of supernatural phenomena have gone down, not up.
Have you heard Mitch Hedberg's joke on this, which is that Bigfoot is blurry? That's the actual problem. He's like, if you think about it, it makes it much scarier. He's just this
amalgamous
blurry monster.
He's actually a cloud. He's Jesus. But no, okay. So UFOs are an interesting one, and if you take a step back and you think of the classic UFO shape, right?
Are we talking about in my head? There's two of them. There's that cigar one, and then there's the disc.
Right. So let's think of first. Let's start with the disc one,
okay,
which I find interesting. Right. So the disc one is interesting because if you take a unidirectional wing, right, or if you in 2D, which is a symmetrical.
Yeah, you effectively get what looks like a saucer.
And you rotate it in 3D, you end up with a saucer. And the reason that's relevant is if you had a machine that you wanted to generate lift in every direction, it would look like a UFO. And then you would just pitch it up in the direction you wanted, it would generate lift. But also, UFOs are often shown to hover, right? So what does it matter what shape it is? If you can hover, which is actually very hard to do as a vehicle, right? If you can hover, if you have that kind, and they fly off in an instant and do all this crazy stuff, right? Where they clearly aren't hurting for thrust, right? Well, if you can do that, why do you need a lifting device? Why are you shaped like something that has to universally generate lift in any direction? Now, there's two options. One is it's a coincidence. Whatever electronics or whatever design this ship has, it makes sense for it to be, to have rotational symmetry, to be a disc, or it just maybe that makes sense, right? The drive or whatever propulsion form you have happens to be a donut shape, and you just kind of wrapped the top over it, and you live in the middle. Maybe that's the answer, right? And I don't know, obviously. The other option is for some strange reason you do need to generate lift. Right. And again, so why? So if you do need to generate lift, that says you have to operate in an atmosphere. That would kind of hint at you being more human made.
Which is fair, but my question would be, could it be two different types of propulsion such that when you enter an atmosphere, you need one type, which is basically you need something that's, I don't know if it's necessarily anti-gravity, but it's definitely like, opposing gravity. So hence like upward propulsion. The only reason I say two different types is when you're in the vacuum of space, you know what I mean? Like you could have a potentially completely different type of propulsion. No?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're not wrong. It is possible. That's an answer. It just seems really weirdly coincidental. No more so than a UFO would need wings.
Okay.
Right. Why would a UFO have wings? right? I mean, it's a spacecraft most of the time. Why would it need wings, right? Similarly, a UFO is a 3D wing. Well, why? Unless it spends most of its time in the atmosphere, but it's a spaceship, so it doesn't, right? The space shuttle makes a terrible airplane. That's why when they had to fly it from one place to another, they strapped it on top of an actual airplane, because your odds of getting that thing off the floor, short of a rocket, was zero.
Sure, but doesn't this lead to a different hint, which is if that's the little craft that makes it into most of the atmospheres, then there is an interstellar craft that it came from.
Well, yeah, there is a mothership. I'm just saying it asks some interesting questions, right? That they're often portrayed to be these discs. But as you say, some of them are cigars.
Cigar-shaped.
And some of the reports, if you read the UFO, they make good reading. Some of them have really weird descriptions too. Like some of them are completely different, like weird glass spheres with cubes in the middle.
So a friend of mine is actually a Navy fighter pilot. We went to Cambridge together. He's a really good buddy. And he said, I'm literally directly quoting here, he said he almost took one of those things down his intake at 12,000 feet. He did a 180 to go see it, and his exact description was transparent sphere with black cube inside.
Right. And there are, and I'm not here to say whether any of this is true or false, but man, there is a surprising amount of consistency on some of these descriptions. Maybe they're man-made, maybe they're not. One element is, if you're the US government, wouldn't it be great to pretend you had crazy out there supernatural-esque, alien technology, right?
Such that you could deflect from classified tech?
Yeah, just get your adversaries chasing imaginary technology.
I think we did that. That was Star Wars in the 80s, right?
It's all kinds of things, right? But why not do that, right? Why not create entirely false programs, have people chase after it, have them put it in place, have them waste their espionage looking for things that didn't exist, and then trying to catch them in the process, right? And so there's all of that. But I mean, on the flip side, though, you say, okay, we live in a very average sun. As we look more into the universe, it seems our solar system's pretty standard.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in a pretty average galaxy, honestly. Not particularly extraordinary. There are many like it, but this one is ours. And so you're saying, all right, best guesses would say there's 1 to 2 Earth-like bodies around most of your average. The average sun has 1 to 2 Earth-like bodies around it.
Roughly. How many average suns would be in our galaxy? Roughly.
Well, the average galaxy contains about 100 billion stars.
But we probably can't thrive around, a red giant or something.
No, so
right?
on average of those 100 billion, there is 1 to 2 Goldilocks planet on each one. So Goldilocks means a rocky planet, or I think it actually technically means any planet within a range that is warm enough but not too hot to sustain what we would consider life, right?
Right. As in it's not cold enough that the water would be solid ice, and it's not hot enough to where it would effectively boil off.
Right. And so you ask this very real question. Okay, so if there's 100 billion stars and the average star has 1 to 2 Goldilocks planets, it means there's between 100 and 200 billion Earth-ish, I don't know if they're like Earth,
and it seems that
planets in our galaxy alone, of which there are 100 billion, give or take, galaxies in the known universe.
Basically, when we do the math, right, we're looking at over the span of, let's say, 13 billion years, roughly 14 billion for the universe or whatever it is.
Yeah, whatever it is.
And then several hundred billion, if not trillion, actual planets in the Goldilocks zone. We're basically looking at it being not only
it seems like a mathematical certainty,
possible,
right?
but it not only looks possible, but it looks effectively certain. And you could even go as far as to say it could be certain, like at this time, like we are definitely not alone.
Yeah, our sun showed up about 5 billion years after the galaxy started, right? Which, man, leaves a lot of wiggle room for someone else. Like ours was not an early star.
Right.
I mean, we're early-ish in the lifespan of the universe, but
prior to the heat death of the universe.
Right, which is a fair way away, right? Although who knows, maybe I'll see it. But there was plenty of opportunity for lots of other suns to show up and lots of other similar planets and all kinds of things. So you ask the question then, like you say, when you take 1 billion, 100 billion, right, 200 billion, and then times it by how many, like, where is all this life? It should be out there, right?
Right.
Yeah, sure, it's a 1 in a million chance that life evolved at all, but when you know there's 200 billion planets out there, like, well, then you're guaranteed many times over to have life, right? And so you ask the question, where is it? The classic Fermi paradox, where is it then, right?
And the Fermi paradox is basically, just again, for those of us listening, it's basically where...
So the Fermi paradox says, if there is life out there in the universe, where the fuck is it? Or if I have neighbors, where are they? Why don't I ever see them put the trash out? Okay, I know I'm too far. I can't go there and look for them. But man, I should see if I have I can't kick the front door in and look for my neighbors in their house. But man, I should see them put the trash out. I should see them turn their lights on. I should see them do things that indicate they're there, right?
So I guess my question would be, let's reverse this problem. Let's say that you're on a planet that's literally at Proxima Centauri, so about four light years away.
Close planet, yeah.
Pretty close. Theoretically, the closest that could support life. So if you're there, and basically, how would you be able to tell that life is even remotely alive and well on Earth? Is there a way to do that?
So it's possible. I mean, if you had...
How would we signal it? Would it be radio waves or...
Yeah, I mean, and that is one of the answers to the Fermi paradox, right? Is that we're sort of like somebody there letting smoke signals off at the campfire while airplanes fly over the top of our heads saying, well, there's no one around me because nobody else is doing smoke signals, right?
Right.
If you have a civilization that's capable of traveling the universe faster than the speed of light, as we imagine these very advanced civilizations to be, there's nothing that guarantees they communicate on radio waves anymore, right?
Correct.
And so we might just be at a time when no one else happens to be chattering. And if you're not, we've only been listening for so long, so blah, blah, blah. So there's like a coincidence part, like maybe just no one's talking in a way that we're listening right now. And you could see it, right? I mean, you could just have a good enough telescope to look, you could just look at a planet, and if you had a big enough telescope, you could see it, right? The biggest telescopes we've built are pathetically small. On a, if you have the ability...
Even the new, I'm sorry to interrupt, even the Webb telescope?
The James Webb is a fantastic piece of technology,
gorgeous.
Right?
It's
glorious. But on the idea, you're like, oh, I can interstellar travel.
Right.
Why can't I build a 20-mile wide telescope in space? I'll construct it in space.
Right.
I don't have to worry about getting there or unfolding it. Built just as we do on Earth. We build enormous telescopes in space in a perfect position, stare out into the universe. You can do that. Who even knows that a telescope, as we were classically imagining it, one that looks at light, is even like maybe you can get equipment that's good enough to pick up gravitational waves. You can re-image the universe of gravity waves, right? Just as some of the LIGO experiments do. Okay, we're looking blatantly at enormously big, heavy things. But if you get sensitive enough, there's all kinds of ways you might sense the world around you. And so these civilizations could well know we're here. But just as when I drive down a highway, right, I don't stop for every anthill that I drive past, right? Because they're so common. I know there's greenery all the way. I know there's anthills all the way. I don't care that they're there. And so, an option that I always consider the Fermi...
Maybe that's a human flaw. Maybe we should care.
Well, perhaps, but I'm just saying an answer to the Fermi paradox that most people you don't often see touted is life is ubiquitous in the universe. It's so common that it's devalued, right? And the assumption was always that Earth was this rare jewel in the universe, that there were very few life-supporting planets.
Right.
As we've gotten better telescopes, we've come to realize they may be super common. At which point, like, why would I fight you for it?
It's an interesting question. And truth be told, again, just looking at one planet's history, ours, civilizations meeting each other never works out well if you actually think about how this has worked throughout history. Now, maybe it's just because we were primitive, but I would argue that even though our technology is advanced, our mentality hasn't necessarily. But, I'm just saying, think about it. Like when two cultures completely ignorant of one another end up meeting throughout history, that really hasn't gone well for at least one of the cultures.
Yeah, that would be much of human
So
history,
maybe it's
wouldn't it?
not such a well.
Yeah,
maybe the aliens have started to realize that maybe that's also ubiquitous and said we should probably just stay away because this doesn't usually end up well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a complete opportunity. There's a lot of reasons. I mean, one thing I find very interesting, right? So, humanity is supposed to hit 10 billion by 2050.
I think
right?
we just hit 8, right?
About
Yeah.
Do you know what's super relevant about 10 billion at 2050, other than nice round numbers?
Tell me.
That's a maximum. At 2050, at 10 billion, we go into decline. So we start to shrink as a species.
Why do you say that?
That's what they think. That's what I'm not saying that's a theory. That's what people who are predicting population. It's what Muskie Boy is going on about.
We start to decline in terms of population.
Total number on this planet, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, 10 billion.
Because we consume too many resources? Or
No, because if you provide people with education, if you give them access to sexual health care,
yes,
if you lower child mortality and you extend the average age of a human, people have less kids. If you look at, and I'm going to say Native Americans, I don't mean that to mean obviously classical group of people who were here before the white people showed up.
In other Native American Indians, but yeah, I understand.
I mean
what
Native Americans as in the native population, the people that live here now.
Correct.
Versus an immigrant that might, like me, that might show up tomorrow,
sure,
right? Or showed up yesterday, right? If you look at the native population of America, again, the people who are, born in America, right? They have on average about 1.8 children per woman. You need 2 children per woman to sustain the population.
That's
right?
a good point.
And what you're saying, we're just not doing that. Japan has this problem, time and a half.
Tremendously. Right? They have a very, very advanced society. They've been in decline for at least a decade or two.
Right. I mean, and so the answer to that, the answer is to bring in immigrants. The whole Western world has done this, right? Like, you need immigrants to come in. And at the beginning, America would take white people, right? The Irish and the Italians. They weren't very liked, but still you brought them in, right? And then you ran out of white people to import. Now you're starting the brown people in. And now, of course, ironically, the GOP, the Republicans are freaking out because what they've realized is America is pretty much guaranteed to become a white minority country by 2050, right? It's not a theory. That's going to happen. I mean, nothing short of those children were already born.
Sure.
And they're going to grow up and they're going to have kids.
I don't know
right?
why. Personally, I don't know why anybody fears that. Truth be told, this is America. The whole point, the whole reason that we're number one. And again, I say this, as a subjective and, subjective number and as an American, so it's pretty biased. But it hasn't been anything to do with our skin color. It's actually been the exact opposite. It's because of our diversity that that we've led the world for quite some time. At least I would argue.
And I would completely agree.
I would argue the British Empire was reasonably the same way at their time, only because you guys had every corner of the globe. At one point in time, the British Empire spanned every corner, such that the
sun never sets. Yeah,
yeah, and it's because you can't trust an Englishman in the dark.
Yeah, please.
You haven't heard that one?
You can trust an Englishman in the light. No, I mean, and please don't get me wrong. I'm not. This isn't some like weird racist rant. But I'm just saying that is happening because that's what's happening. Is you bring people in. People who tend to immigrate tend to have lower standards of all of these. It is a great thing, but they tend to have lower standards of those things. They're coming to this country for a reason, right? It's because they want things for their kids. It's because there is more opportunity here. It's because the world's going to be better, right? But when they come from a place where they haven't had as much of those things, where the child mortality is worse, where the access to education is lower for women, right? Where the access for sexual health is lower, they have more kids, right?
So 10 billion is the upper limit.
10 billion is the upper limit because by 2050, you've got a handle on it. Mm-hmm. At 2050, you've just about balanced. The Western world's kind of probably dipped even lower than 1.8. You've taken enough people out of extreme poverty that those that are left are sort of balancing it.
Good.
Right? No, great. But then what do you do? Right? Because our entire concept of classical economics
is based on growth of population.
Based on the idea of growth of the economy through growth of population. That's why most of the Western world kept letting people in, because they're like, well, we have to grow the economy,
It's pretty
3
classical.
to 5%. So I have to grow my population, whatever is 1 to 2%, because I have to have extra workforce to do that. That's classical economics. So we kept bringing people in. And if you look at almost any country in terms of what their estimates of illegal immigration is, they will look at what they need to grow their population by a couple percent, take what they think their illegal immigration is off, and let that many illegals in. So people are like, oh, we have to stop the illegals. If you do that, your country just lets more illegals in.
I think Singapore is the one that has this like down to a science at this point.
Oh, yeah. That and the chewing gum. Anyway, so all of that is to say, it's a really interesting place because from the point of view of being a solar empire then, for the idea that you would invade another planet, you're like, why? We actually more or less filled this planet up. Like if you could be a bit more sustainable, it's not even full. And if you clump the cities together and build them a bit taller, figure that shit out, you honestly could leave a lot of this planet untouched.
I mean, if you basically had federal codes that forced everybody to have solar panels on X amount of the building, rooftops, etc., like we can get to a sustainability
And then if you
aspect.
want, you go into the solar system. You say, okay, what if 10 billion people spread into the solar system? You're like, man, then there's basically infinite riches for everyone, right? There is, like, just this planet could be sustainable enough, let alone you go to the solar system, you start stealing minerals from asteroid belts and whatever else.
I was going to say, I was going to literally say this. Speaking of that, I mean, forget UFOs. No, I mean, even including UFOs, they don't have to be intelligent. There's been like various asteroids that have passed us that I think were either full of gold or one was like an actual solid diamond. And it's like, if that thing crashed to Earth, like that's it. The world economy is just screwed. Because you end up with this unbelievably huge mass of something that was relatively rare previously.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Oort asteroid belt, the asteroid belt in our solar system, is filled with innumerable riches.
Sure.
I mean, there is an effective infinity. Just in our solar system alone, for those 10 billion people, there's an effective infinity. And you might say, well, Leon, if you come and you give people a solar system's worth of resources, they might really get quite horny about that and fuck a bunch, and a bunch of kids will fall out. And I say maybe, but like, I mean, look, as you've given people more resources, what they've done is they've produced less children.
Sure.
And so what you might see is that naturally most alien races grow enough to fill a solar system, and they're like, yeah, we're done. This is enough. I mean, I live forever. I've got my infinity jacuzzi. I've got my spaceship that goes faster than the speed of light and go anywhere I want. Like, why do I need kids when I'm immortal?
I'm pretty set.
I'm having good fun. I've got my blackjack, I've got my hookers. Why do I need kids?
Well, that begs the question of this. It begs the question of, if we want all these things and we want to get in touch with you, Leon, how can we find you? Can we find you on LinkedIn, or what are the socials that we're looking at here?
Yeah, I'm a great Luddite when it comes to social media, actually. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn/Leon Vanstone. Maybe there'll be a link or something you can provide.
Sure.
If you want to hit me up. As long as you're not trying to sell me some nonsense, I normally accept every ad. I'm not a picky man. But yeah, as the least ridiculous social media I could find, LinkedIn seems to be doing me well. But yeah, hit me up. We'll have a chat. I mean, I'm happy to come talk to people. I do love the sound of my own voice.
So do we.
Yeah.
And finally, of course, comes the main one, which is, if there is a technology that you could just will into existence, and you can't say teleportation, that's cheating. Everybody says that one. But something other than that, what would it be? What would you sort of will into existence?
So I suppose keeping within my theme, I would want something called a single stage to orbit vehicle. So if I fly to another country, if I fly back to England, right, I get on a plane.
Yeah.
That aeroplane, let's say it's an A380, which is one of the world's largest airplanes.
Yep.
The cost of an A380 is actually, almost as if its name implies, about $360 million. Maybe it's 320 off the top of my head. That doesn't include the engines. Each one of those engines is about 10 million each. It's got 4, adds about another 40 million. Let's call it 400 mil.
Sure.
Round up, right? So $400 million vehicle.
You got the first class seats. You got the,
You got the first class, you got the business. I'm always in economy, but it's just because I'm a chump. But, okay, you have $400 million vehicle. And I can fly 10,000 miles return, right, to England and back on that for about $1,000 economy. You say, okay, how much does, you know, Elon Musk, of course, you know, used rocket salesman, how much does one of his vehicles cost, right? Okay, that's about 120 used, 100, maybe less, 80 for a Falcon 9. He's getting there. He's getting credit to the man. He is getting the price down.
Sure.
Credit to SpaceX. They're getting the price down.
Yeah.
But still, it's a fraction of the cost of that airplane, but the ticket price is enormous.
Right.
Ticket price of going to space on a Falcon 9 is tens of millions, $10 million, whatever, right? I want to see a world, and certainly it should be acknowledged, even today, you know, to say I find it difficult to say we're a spacefaring species, right? Less than 1,000 people have ever been to space. Do you know, I mean, even to say that we're an airfaring species, one, it's largely only the Western world that's gone on a plane. That's about 1 to 2 billion people.
Yeah.
Two, you know, even if you look at America, only about 90% of Americans have ever been on a plane. So 10% of Americans have never gotten on a plane.
I don't know what the number is, but it's even crazier. The people who have actually been out of the countries is
right. It's
even to Mexico or Canada. It's low.
Right, and so to say then that even to go as far as to say, is humanity really an airfaring? You know, is that what we do? Who knows, right? But you need to see the equivalent of air travel to space. I should be able to buy, right? We're in Austin, Texas. It is further to the Alamo in San Antonio right now than it is to space.
That's wild.
Space is about 100 miles up.
Straight up.
Straight up. That's it, right? If I could get in a car that would drive up, I could be there in less than 2 hours.
Yeah.
Right? And so in my mind, you want a single-stage orbit vehicle. You want a space plane. You want a vehicle that can take off from a runway, take me to space, dump some stuff out, land back on a runway, refuel, and take back off 2 hours later. And we don't have that technology. Because when you can do that, you can put all these people in space. When
they're in the space, would they be weightless? Would they be weightless?
Well, they'd be in microgravity. They'd be in orbit, right? So you're technically not weightless. You're always the thing about being.
You can float around.
Yeah, you'd be floaty, right?
Okay.
You'd be floaty, and so because the thing about being in orbit is the way orbit works is you are still under gravity, right? Gravity pulls you towards the planet. The trick is if you can move forward so fast, the horizon falls away from you at the same speed that you do, right? So the horizon drops the same amount you dropped. So if you can do that, you forever fall.
Yeah, that's orbit. Exactly.
Right, that's orbit. And it's like being stuck in an elevator at that point. The elevator's falling, you're falling. You're both under the force of gravity, of course, but relative to each other, you're super floaty, right? Sure. And so in my mind, the technology I want to see is a space plane, because if you can make it $1,000 for me or you to go to space, for $1,000, you're talking about the same amount of cost you would pay for air freight is now what it costs for space freight, right?
Right.
You can put all this shit up there. We can all go. I mean, a bunch of people are going to die. A bunch of fuck-ups going to happen. A bunch of lessons going to get learned. But that's just sort of humanity for you, right? Space needs to go from being this hallowed, sacred thing. I want to make it boring, man. Like
pedestrian.
So my life objective was, and still is, I got on this plane once to fly back to the UK. It'd be stormy in Austin. And, for the viewers that aren't in Texas, man, the Texas sunsets really are something else, right? So we get on this plane. It's pissing it down. It's awful. But we take off and we punch through the cloud layer, and about 1,000 feet,
right,
300 meters, we punch through. And I see this like whoomph of red and pink blast through the plane window. I've got the middle seat because I'm a fucking chump, right? I'm not one of those guys that like jumps the other thing. I've got the middle seat. Fucking flight back to you. Anyway, and I look out the window and the view is amazing.
Stunning.
It's like 10,000 foot Texas, cumulus nimbus storm cloud shit, right? And then it's sunset too. So the bottoms are in shade, the tops are in sunlight, and it's this beautiful gradient all the way through from sunlight to reds to pinks to purples to everything, right? And I'm like, this is amazing. And you can see all these like offshoots of these things through this. It's just gorgeous. It's a gorgeous view.
Yeah.
And the woman who has the window seat slams the window shut.
Ooh.
And I could have cried. I could have cried.
Really?
Yes, but not because I thought she'd done something awful, right? because that woman had seen enough glorious sunsets from that plane window that she'd rather watch the movie. And I want to live in a world where you can sit in the Capella module or equivalent of your spaceship and watch Aurora Borealis rolling
from the top,
from space, rolling over the Earth's magnetosphere, and be so bored of seeing that you close the blinds to watch the movie, because that's when humanity's gone to space.
That's fair. I don't know. There's definitely something that's going to always be magical about that stuff, but
it will for the first time, for the 1000th time.
That's fair.
I'm just saying, like, that's where I want to get. I want to get to the point where people are doing that. That's not, because in my mind, that's progress. When you have seen these beautiful views enough times, you're like, yeah, whatever.
It's true. I mean, I lived in Rome, and actually the time in 2004 when I lived in Rome, the time I literally decided to leave was when I was in I had all the like Roman lifestyle. I literally lived in the Trevi Fountain Square. I had my little scooter, like the whole deal. And the truth of the matter was, one time I was ending up coming back from a friend's house, and I drove past the Colosseum and didn't look up. And I realized that I didn't look up, and I was going, wow, I can't believe that just happened. The magic is gone.
Yeah, and that's what I want to take the magic out of that immediate piece. I want to move us past it. We have to move on.
Yeah.
This few thousand people in space, yes, they're heroes, but let's move on. So were the first people that flew, right? So were the Wright brothers. We experience every day what just your grandparents may have dreamed to be a pilot. If you were your grandparents, if they were kids, being a pilot was like being an astronaut. And here we are today, and I want to make being an astronaut obsolete. I want to make it boring.
Yeah.
That's progress in my mind, right? It's just, let's move on. What's the next thing? Let's go.
I agree.
And so in my mind, single-stage orbit vehicles. Contact your senator today.
On that note, Leon, it's been unbelievable having you here. Thanks so much.
I've had a great time. Thank you.
This has been amazing. This has been, we have been standing on the shoulders of giants.
We are.
With David Mackay, myself, and thanks, everybody.